The year was 1988, and Oprah Winfrey's star was rising faster than anyone could have predicted. Her talk show had begun as a small local program in Chicago, but it was quickly turning into something much bigger. People all across America were tuning in every afternoon to watch this warm, engaging woman who seemed to really care about her guests and their stories. On a bright Tuesday morning, Oprah arrived at her studio earlier than usual. She liked these quiet moments before the hustle of the day began. As she walked through the empty set, coffee in hand, she thought about how far she had come. Just a few years ago, no one would have believed that a poor girl from rural Mississippi would become one of the most recognized faces on television. "Morning, Ms. Winfrey," called out Tom, one of the cameramen who had been with her since the beginning. "Ready for another big day?" Oprah smiled and nodded. "Always ready, Tom. Who knows what we'll learn today?" That was the thing about Oprah. She never saw her show as just entertainment. For her, each episode was a chance to learn something new, to understand people better, to bring important conversations into living rooms across America. Growing up poor in Mississippi, wearing dresses made from potato sacks, facing abuse as a young girl, these experiences hadn't broken Oprah. Instead, they had given her an incredible ability to connect with people from all walks of life. When guests shared their painful stories on her show, they weren't talking to a polished TV host. They were talking to someone who understood struggle firsthand. As the studio began filling with staff, Oprah reviewed the day's schedule. They were tackling a difficult topic: survivors of domestic violence sharing their stories of escape and recovery. Other shows wouldn't touch such heavy material in the middle of the afternoon, but Oprah knew these stories needed to be told. "Are you sure about today's show?" asked David, one of the network executives who had stopped by. "It's pretty heavy stuff. Viewers might change the channel." Oprah looked at him steadily. If even one woman watching sees herself in these stories and finds the courage to leave a dangerous situation, then it's worth any drop in ratings. The executive sighed and walked away. He wasn't the first to question her approach, and he wouldn't be the last. The traditional TV world wasn't quite sure what to make of Oprah Winfrey. Female hosts were supposed to be pretty and pleasant, sticking to light topics and celebrity gossip. Black hosts were rarely given the chance to lead major shows at all. And here was Oprah, breaking every rule and somehow drawing more viewers every month. As the audience filed in, Oprah noticed how different they looked from the audiences at other talk shows. There were women of all ages and backgrounds, many who had taken time off work or arranged childcare just to be here. They didn't come for flashy giveaways or celebrity sightings. They came because they felt Oprah understood them. 5 minutes to air, called the floor director. Oprah took a deep breath and centered herself. In just a few years, her approach to television had started a quiet revolution. She didn't just interview people, she listened to them. She wasn't afraid to show emotion or to let her guests show theirs. When someone cried on her show, she didn't exploit it for drama. She handed them a tissue and often cried right alongside them. The red light on the camera blinked on, and Oprah stepped onto the stage to thunderous applause. What the audience didn't know was that earlier that morning, she had received a call from her assistant. A well-known journalist from a prestigious magazine had requested an interview with her. He was known for his tough, often critical pieces on media figures. He specifically said he wants to discuss the substance of your show, her assistant had explained, making air quotes around the word substance. Oprah had simply nodded. "Schedule it," she'd said. After all she'd overcome in life, one skeptical journalist didn't frighten her. Little did she know that this upcoming interview would become one of the most memorable moments of her early career, for reasons no one could have expected. 3 weeks after agreeing to the interview, Oprah stood by the window in her office, watching the afternoon rain tap against the glass. Her show that day had gone well. A conversation with parents of children with rare diseases that had moved everyone in the studio to tears and action. The phone lines had lit up with viewers wanting to donate or help. This was what made her work worthwhile. "He's here," said Rita, Oprah's assistant, poking her head through the door. "The journalist from National Weekly. Should I bring him up now or make him wait?" There was a hint of protectiveness in Rita's voice. After working with Oprah for years, she'd become good at spotting trouble. "Bring him up," Oprah said, smoothing down her bright yellow dress. "And maybe bring us some of that herbal tea I like." As Rita left, Oprah glanced at the notes on her desk. research she'd done on the journalist, Peter Donovan. He was well respected in serious news circles, had won awards for his political interviews, and was known for making even seasoned politicians squirm under his questioning. He'd recently written pieces criticizing what he called the softening of American media. Oprah had a feeling she knew where this interview was heading. 5 minutes later, Peter Donovan walked into her office. He was tall and thin with silver hair and wire-rimmed glasses, carrying an expensive leather bag that probably cost more than what Oprah's family had lived on for months when she was a child. "Ms. Winfrey," he said, extending his hand. His handshake was firm but brief, as if he wanted minimal contact. "Thank you for making time in your schedule. Please call me Oprah," she said warmly, gesturing to the comfortable chairs by the coffee table. "Everyone does." Peter sat down stiffly, pulling out a recorder and a notebook. "You don't mind if I record, do you? For accuracy." "Not at all," Oprah replied. "I record all my interviews too." Peter didn't smile at her attempt to find common ground. As he set up his recorder, Oprah noticed him looking around her office at the colorful artwork from local artists, the shelves of books, the pictures of her with ordinary people rather than celebrities. His eyes lingered on a thank you card obviously made by a child, propped on her desk. "Interesting decor," he said in a tone that suggested it was anything but, "not what I expected." Rita brought in the tea, setting it down with an extra loud clink when she placed Peter's cup in front of him. He didn't thank her. "So," he began, not touching his tea, "let's talk about your show. It's quite the phenomenon, isn't it? You've managed to attract quite an audience." "I'm grateful for every person who watches," Oprah said. "I think people connect with authenticity." Peter murmured, jotting something down. "And what would you say is the purpose of your program? Entertainment? Distraction?" Oprah took a sip of her tea before answering. "I'd say connection. Creating a space where people can share their truths and others can recognize pieces of themselves in those stories." "But surely you'd agree there's very little actual news or information being conveyed." Peter pressed, looking up from his notebook. "Unlike, say, the evening news or current affairs programs." Before Oprah could answer, they heard the sound of excited voices in the hallway. The audience from today's show was leaving through the main exit, and some were lingering, hoping for a glimpse of Oprah. Peter frowned at the noise. "Your fans seem quite enthusiastic." "They're not fans," Oprah corrected gently. "They're viewers. People who invite me into their living rooms every day. There's a difference." As if on cue, there was a soft knock on the door, and Rita poked her head in again. "I'm sorry to interrupt, but Mrs. Chen from today's show is still here. She wanted to give you something before she left." Oprah glanced at Peter. "Do you mind?" "It'll just take a minute." He gave a tight smile that didn't reach his eyes. "By all means." An older Asian woman entered, clutching a small package wrapped in tissue paper. Her eyes were still red from crying during the show. "Ms. Winfrey," she said softly, "I just wanted to thank you. After you talked to my daughter today about her son's condition, it was the first time I've seen her smile in months. The first time she felt hope." She handed Oprah the package. "These are cookies I made, nothing special, but from my heart." Oprah stood and embraced the woman. "Thank you, Mrs. Chen. Your family's courage is what makes our show possible." After Mrs. Chen left, Oprah turned back to find Peter watching her with an unreadable expression. "Shall we continue?" he asked, his pen poised. Something in his tone had shifted, becoming even more skeptical. "I'd like to discuss what some critics call the Oprah effect, this tendency of your viewers to become emotionally invested in what many consider to be simply entertainment." Oprah sat down, still holding Mrs. Chen's cookies. The interview was just beginning, but she could already feel the direction it was heading, and it wasn't going to be pleasant. The interview with Peter continued in Oprah's office as rain tapped steadily against the windows. What had started as a professional conversation was slowly turning into something that felt more like a cross-examination. Peter's questions became sharper, his tone more dismissive with each answer Oprah gave. "So you don't think there's any problem with blurring the line between news and entertainment?" Peter asked, leaning forward slightly. His recorder sat between them, capturing every word. "I've never claimed to be a news program," Oprah replied calmly. "But I do think we tackle important issues that affect real people's lives." Peter wrote something in his notebook, his pen pressing hard enough that Oprah could hear it scratch against the paper. But wouldn't you agree that your approach, getting people to cry on camera, share their most personal problems, is a form of exploitation? Oprah took a deep breath. She'd heard this criticism before, usually from people who had never actually watched her show. I don't get people to cry, as you put it. I create a space where people feel safe enough to be honest about their experiences. There's a big difference. Is there? Peter raised an eyebrow. Let's talk about your show last month with the family who lost their home in that fire. The mother broke down completely. The ratings for that episode were quite high, weren't they? Rita appeared at the door with fresh tea, giving Oprah a moment to collect her thoughts. She could feel her patience wearing thin, but years of interviewing difficult people had taught her to stay calm. Yes, that episode did well, Oprah admitted after Rita left. But not because people enjoy watching others suffer. It did well because viewers connected with that family's story. They saw their own fears reflected there. And more importantly, that episode raised over $200,000 to help that family and others affected by the fire. Peter waved his hand dismissively. Charity is all well and good, but it's not just about charity, Oprah interrupted, surprising herself with her firmness. It's about connection, about helping people realize they're not alone in their struggles. For a moment, Peter seemed taken aback by her directness. He adjusted his glasses and tried a different approach. Let's talk about your background, he said. You've been quite open about your difficult childhood. Do you think perhaps your own trauma is why you focus so much on emotional content rather than intellectual discourse? The question hung in the air. It wasn't just professionally insulting, it was personal, suggesting that Oprah's entire career was just a reaction to her past trauma rather than a thoughtful choice. Several members of her team, who had been quietly working nearby, looked up in shock. Oprah felt a flash of anger but didn't let it show on her face. Instead, she stood up. I think we could both use a change of scenery. Would you like to continue this while I show you around the studio? Peter seemed surprised but nodded and gathered his things. As they walked through the hallways, staff members greeted Oprah warmly. Some gave Peter curious or protective glances. We've just expanded this section, Oprah explained, leading him into a large room with several desks. This is where our research team works. Before every show, they spend weeks verifying facts, finding experts, and making sure we're presenting topics accurately. Peter glanced around the busy room. Quite the operation. Each show takes about a month of preparation, Oprah continued. Even topics that might seem simple on the surface, we research them thoroughly. When we did our show on depression last year, our team consulted with 12 different mental health professionals to ensure we were providing accurate information. As they continued the tour, Oprah showed him the library where they kept resources for guests, the comfortable rooms where people could collect themselves before and after appearing on the show, and finally, the empty studio itself. Standing on the stage where she filmed her show every day, Oprah turned to face Peter. You know, when I started in television, I was told to stick to the script, to not show emotion, to keep a professional distance. But it never felt right to me. It felt dishonest. Peter was writing notes again, but at least he was listening. The first time I went off script and just had a real conversation with a guest, my producers were horrified, Oprah continued. But the audience responded. They could tell the difference between something rehearsed and something real. And that's your definition of good television? Something real? Peter asked, his tone suggesting he found the concept simplistic. I believe good television serves its viewers, Oprah replied. Sometimes that means informing them. Sometimes it means challenging them. And yes, sometimes it means moving them emotionally. Peter closed his notebook suddenly. Ms. Winfrey, let's be direct. Many serious journalists, myself included, worry that shows like yours are dumbing down American discourse. That you're teaching viewers to react emotionally rather than think critically. How do you respond to that? The question was blunt, almost hostile. A few staff members who had been cleaning up nearby stopped what they were doing, watching the exchange with concern. Oprah met Peter's gaze steadily. The tension between them had been building throughout the interview, and now it had reached a breaking point. What she said next would determine the entire tone of his article, and she knew it. Standing in the empty studio, Oprah looked at Peter as his question hung in the air between them. The cleaning staff had quietly slipped out, sensing the tension. Even the usual background noise of the building seemed to have faded away. "I think we should finish this conversation in my office," Oprah said calmly. She wasn't going to have this moment play out in front of her staff. Back in her office, with the door closed, Oprah sat across from Peter once more. His recorder was still running, capturing everything. "Now, you were asking about dumbing down American discourse," Oprah said, her voice steady despite the anger she felt bubbling beneath the surface. Peter leaned back in his chair, looking almost pleased that he'd finally gotten under her skin. "Yes, many of my colleagues believe that television like yours, focused on feelings rather than facts, personal stories rather than policy discussions, is harming our society's ability to think critically." Oprah took a sip of water, using the moment to gather her thoughts. She'd faced criticism before, but rarely so directly and dismissively. "You know, last month we did a show about financial literacy," she said. "We brought in experts who taught our audience how to budget, how to save for retirement, how to understand mortgage terms. I've received over 300 letters from people who opened their first savings account after watching." Peter waved his hand dismissively. "One show about finances hardly. The month before that," Oprah continued, not letting him interrupt, "we did a series on education. We highlighted schools that are succeeding despite limited resources. We discussed different learning styles and how parents can advocate for their children. My team spent weeks researching those topics." "But those shows don't get the ratings that your emotional episodes do," Peter countered. "The crying, the personal revelations." "Let me ask you something, Peter," Oprah said, leaning forward. "Have you actually watched my show? Not clips, not highlights. Have you sat down and watched a full episode?" Peter hesitated just long enough for Oprah to know the answer. "I'm familiar enough with your format," he said stiffly. "So that's a no," Oprah said. She smiled slightly, but there was no warmth in it. "You're writing about something you haven't experienced firsthand. Isn't that against the principles of good journalism?" Peter's face flushed. "I've seen enough too." "No," Oprah said firmly. "You haven't. Because if you had, you would know that we don't exploit emotions. We acknowledge them. We don't simplify complex issues. We make them relatable. There's a difference." Peter adjusted his glasses, clearly uncomfortable with being challenged. "Ms. Winfrey, the fact remains that your show primarily attracts female viewers, mostly housewives and what's wrong with housewives?" Oprah asked, her voice rising slightly for the first time. "Are you suggesting that women at home don't deserve quality content? That their interests are somehow less valid than those of your readers?" "That's not what I—" "Let me be very clear," Oprah said, rising from her chair. "What you're calling emotional content is actually human experience. And yes, many of those experiences belong to women, to poor people, to minorities, people whose stories weren't being told on television before my show." She walked to her bookshelf and pulled out a folder. "This is viewer mail from just last week. A woman in Ohio wrote that our show on domestic violence gave her the courage to leave her abusive husband after 15 years. A man in Florida wrote that our discussion about father-son relationships helped him reconnect with his teenage son after years of silence." She placed the folder on the table between them. "Is that what you call dumbing down discourse?" Peter didn't reach for the folder. Instead, he leaned forward, his expression hardening. "Ms. Winfrey, let's cut to the chase. Your show is successful because you've mastered the art of emotional manipulation. You get regular people to reveal their most private struggles on national television, you bring your audience to tears with sad stories, and you wrap it all up with some inspirational message at the end. It's a formula, not journalism." The room went completely silent. The insult was no longer veiled. It was direct and cutting. It wasn't just an attack on Oprah's show. It was an attack on everything she stood for, everything she'd built over years of hard work. For a brief moment, Oprah felt like that young girl from Mississippi again, being told she didn't belong, that her voice didn't matter. But that feeling passed quickly. She wasn't that girl anymore. She looked directly at Peter, her gaze unwavering. "Turn off your recorder," she said quietly. "I'm sorry." "Turn it off, right now." Something in her tone made Peter reach over and switch off his recorder without further argument. "What I'm about to say isn't for your article," Oprah said, her voice low and controlled. "It's for you, as one human being to another. Peter shifted uncomfortably in his seat. You came here today with your story already written in your head, Oprah continued. You weren't looking for understanding. You were looking for quotes to support what you already believe. That's not journalism, Peter. That's not even good writing. She paused, letting her words sink in. Now you have two choices. You can turn that recorder back on, and we can have a real conversation, one where you actually listen instead of just waiting for your chance to attack. Or we can end this interview right now, and you can go write whatever hit piece you've already decided to write. Peter stared at her, clearly not expecting this response. The confidence he displayed throughout the interview seemed to waver. For the first time, he looked uncertain about how to proceed. For what felt like a full minute, Peter said nothing. He stared at Oprah, his fingers drumming lightly on his notebook. The rain outside had stopped, and the late afternoon sun was beginning to break through the clouds, casting warm light across the office. Finally, he reached over and turned his recorder back on. I'd like to continue, he said, his voice slightly softer than before. Perhaps we could reset this conversation. Oprah nodded, feeling a small sense of victory. She hadn't lost her temper, hadn't stooped to his level of disrespect. Instead, she'd done what she always did on her show, insisted on genuine dialogue. Thank you, she said. Let's start with what I think we both care about, the purpose of media in people's lives. Peter adjusted his glasses. Fair enough. Oprah leaned back in her chair, gathering her thoughts. This was her chance to make him really understand, not just for the sake of his article, but because people like Peter represented the old guard of media that had always looked down on what she was trying to do. When I was a little girl, she began, growing up poor in Mississippi, I never saw anyone who looked like me on television. Not as a host, rarely even as a guest. And the few times I did see black women, they were usually playing maids or were brought on shows to talk about social problems. She paused, watching Peter's face. He was listening, at least. But it wasn't just about race, she continued. It was about what was considered important enough to discuss on TV. Serious shows talked about politics and war and the economy. But the things that affected everyday people's lives, struggling to raise children, dealing with illness, fighting addiction, finding purpose, those were considered soft topics, not worthy of serious attention. She stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the Chicago skyline. One of the first shows I did that really connected with viewers was about sexual abuse. We had women on who shared their stories for the first time. Back then, in the 1980s, people didn't talk about these things publicly. After that show aired, our phone lines were jammed for days. Women calling to say, that happened to me too. I thought I was alone. She turned back to face Peter. That's when I realized that what people call emotional television isn't just about making people cry. It's about breaking the silence around experiences that shape people's lives. It's about telling people your story matters. Peter was writing again, but his furious scribbling had slowed to thoughtful note-taking. You mentioned critical thinking earlier, Oprah said, returning to her seat. I believe critical thinking requires honesty. It requires us to look at the full human experience, not just politics and economics, but also relationships, health, spirituality, all the things that make up a life. But surely you'd agree, Peter said, his tone less confrontational now, that television has a responsibility to inform, not just to reflect emotions back at viewers. Absolutely, Oprah replied. But who decided that information only counts if it's delivered without emotion? Who decided that facts and feelings have to be separate? She picked up a book from her desk, a collection of letters from viewers. A few years ago, we did a show about reading. Just reading. We talked about books that had changed our lives. We had teachers on who shared techniques for helping struggling readers. Nothing fancy, nothing sensational. She opened the book to a marked page. This letter came from a father in West Virginia. He wrote, I never told anyone I couldn't read. I've been faking it my whole life, making excuses, asking my wife to fill out forms for me. After your show, I finally got the courage to join a literacy program. Last week, I read my 6-year-old daughter a bedtime story for the first time. Oprah looked up from the letter. Is that not information that changed a life? Is that not valuable journalism? Peter was silent, and for the first time, Oprah saw something shift in his expression. Not agreement, exactly, but consideration. The rigid certainty he'd walked in with had cracked, just slightly. "Look," Oprah said gently, "I understand your concerns. I really do. You worry that emotional responses prevent clear thinking. But I've found the opposite to be true. When people connect emotionally to an issue, whether it's literacy or healthcare or justice, that's when they're motivated to learn more, to take action." She leaned forward. "My viewers aren't passive recipients of emotional manipulation, as you suggested earlier. They're active participants in a conversation. They write to us, they call us, they tell us when we get things wrong. We've built a community together." Outside the office, the day was winding down. Staff members were gathering their things, heading home to their families. But in Oprah's office, something important was happening. A bridge was being built between two very different visions of what media could be. "You know," Oprah said, her voice warm but firm, "I've never claimed that my show is the only kind of media people need. We need hard-hitting news programs. We need in-depth analysis. We need political debates. But we also need spaces where human experiences are honored, where emotions aren't dismissed as weakness." Peter closed his notebook slowly. "You've given me a lot to think about, Ms. Winfrey." "Oprah," she corrected with a small smile. "Everyone calls me Oprah." As the evening light turned golden outside Oprah's office windows, something remarkable was happening inside. The interview that had started as almost hostile was transforming into a genuine conversation. Peter, who had arrived with his mind firmly made up, was now actually listening. "I suppose I've always viewed emotional television as somewhat manipulative," Peter admitted, taking off his glasses and cleaning them with a handkerchief. This small gesture made him seem suddenly more human, less the hard-hitting journalist and more just a person with his own doubts. "It can be," Oprah agreed, surprising him. "In the wrong hands, emotions can absolutely be used to manipulate. I've seen plenty of shows that use people's pain as entertainment without any deeper purpose." She leaned forward. "But that's not what we're trying to do here." Peter put his glasses back on. "What would you say you're trying to do then, in your own words?" Oprah thought for a moment. "I'm trying to create a place where people can see themselves, hear themselves, and know they're not alone. Where they can learn something that might help them live better, stronger lives." Reva knocked gently on the door and peeked in. "Sorry to interrupt. It's getting late. Do you need anything before I head out?" "We're fine, thank you," Oprah said warmly. As Rita left, Oprah turned back to Peter. "Did you know Rita was one of our first interns? She was a single mom putting herself through school. Now she runs half of our operations." Peter nodded, noting something down. Then he said, "You know, I watched one of your shows while preparing for this interview. It was about mothers who had lost children to gun violence." This surprised Oprah. She'd assumed from his earlier comments that he hadn't watched any full episodes. "I found it uncomfortable," Peter continued. "All that grief on display. But I kept thinking about it afterward. I even mentioned it to my wife." "What did she say?" Oprah asked gently. Peter looked slightly embarrassed. "She said she watches your show regularly. Has for years. She told me I was being, well, she used the word stuffy." He gave a small, reluctant smile. "She said those mothers' stories needed to be heard." "Your wife sounds like a wise woman," Oprah said, returning his smile. "She is," Peter agreed. "Much wiser than me usually." He paused, then added, "She's the one who suggested I might be wrong about your show." The admission clearly wasn't easy for him. Men like Peter, who had spent decades building their reputation on being right, rarely acknowledged they might be mistaken. "Can I ask you something?" Oprah said, pouring them both fresh tea from the pot Rita had left. "Why did this interview matter so much to you? There are plenty of popular TV shows. Why focus on mine?" Peter took a moment before answering. "Honestly, because you're influential. What you say matters to millions of people, and that kind of power should be examined." Oprah nodded. "I agree completely." Peter looked surprised. "You do?" "Of course. I think about that responsibility every day. Every single day when I walk onto that stage, I think about the trust people have placed in me." She stirred her tea slowly. "But I also think you came here because shows like mine represent a change in what media can be, and change is always scary." Instead of getting defensive, Peter considered her words. Perhaps there's some truth to that. He took a sip of his tea. I've been a journalist for 35 years. When I started, the job was clear: report the facts, stay objective, keep your emotions out of it. And that approach has value, Oprah acknowledged. But it's not the only way to connect with people. Sometimes facts alone don't tell the whole story. Like with those mothers, Peter said quietly. Exactly. You could report statistics about gun violence all day long, but hearing a mother talk about her child brings the human reality home in a way numbers never could. They sat in silence for a moment, the tension between them now replaced by a thoughtful calm. You know, Peter finally said, I came here planning to write about how shows like yours are changing American media for the worse. I had my quotes ready, my arguments lined up. Oprah waited, sensing he wasn't finished. Now, I think I need to write something more nuanced. He tapped his pen against his notebook. Not that I'm completely convinced, he added quickly, his old pride reasserting itself. I still have concerns about the blurring of information and emotion. I wouldn't expect you to change your entire perspective based on one conversation, Oprah said, her voice warm with understanding. But I appreciate that you're willing to reconsider. Peter nodded, then looked at his watch. It's getting late. I should probably head out. As they both stood, there was an awkward moment, the kind that comes when two people who started as adversaries aren't sure how to end their encounter. Thank you for your time, Peter said formally, extending his hand. Oprah took it, but instead of the quick handshake they'd shared at the beginning, she held his hand a moment longer. Thank you for listening, Peter, really listening. That's rare, especially from someone who came in with such strong opinions. For the first time in their entire meeting, Peter gave a genuine smile, not polite, not professional, but real. My wife is going to be very interested in hearing about our conversation. Tell her she's welcome on the show anytime, Oprah said with a laugh. As she walked him to the elevator, Oprah realized something important had happened today. Not just a successful interview or a professional victory, but a moment of genuine human connection across a divide of perspectives. And wasn't that, after all, what her work was all about? 3 weeks after the interview, Oprah sat in her living room at home, cup of morning tea in hand, flipping through the latest issue of National Weekly. She'd been so busy with show preparations that she almost forgot Peter's article was coming out today. Almost, but not quite. Despite her outward calm during their interview, his words had stayed with her. There it is, she murmured to herself, finding the article titled The Oprah Effect, Reconsidering Emotional Television. Taking a deep breath, she began to read. The article wasn't what she expected. Instead of the harsh criticism she prepared herself for, Peter had written something thoughtful and balanced. He began by admitting his initial skepticism about her show, even quoting some of his more pointed questions. But then the article took a turn. In preparing to interview Oprah Winfrey, he wrote, I watched an episode featuring mothers who had lost children to gun violence. I found myself uncomfortable with the raw emotion on display. Yet days later, I was still thinking about those women's stories in a way I never had when reading crime statistics. This, I realized, is what Winfrey's supporters call the Oprah effect, the ability to make distant issues deeply personal. Oprah smiled, touched by his honesty. The article continued, exploring both the potential pitfalls and the unique value of what he called emotional journalism. He didn't completely embrace her approach. He still raised concerns about the blurring of entertainment and information, but he treated her work with a respect that was clear to any reader. Oprah's phone rang, interrupting her reading. It was Rita. Have you seen it? Rita asked excitedly. The article is everywhere. People are talking about it online already. I'm reading it now, Oprah replied. It's actually pretty good. Good? It's amazing. He practically admitted he was wrong about you. Do you know how rare that is from someone like him? After chatting with Rita, Oprah finished the article. The final paragraph struck her deeply. Whether one agrees with Winfrey's approach or not, Peter concluded, there is no denying the impact she has had on American media and culture. By creating a space where emotion is not separated from information, where personal stories are valued alongside expert opinions, Winfrey has expanded our understanding of what television can accomplish. Perhaps, as she suggested to me, critical thinking and emotional connection are not opposing forces but complementary ones. In a media landscape increasingly divided between cold facts and hot takes, there may be wisdom in finding the middle ground where Winfrey has made her home. Later that day, as Oprah arrived at the studio for taping, she found a small package waiting on her desk. Inside was a note from Peter and a book, a collection of interviews by legendary journalist Edward R. Murrow. "Thought you might enjoy this," the note read. Murrow understood the power of emotion in journalism better than I gave him credit for. "Thank you for the conversation. My wife sends her regards and says your latest book club selection changed her perspective on grief. Peter." Oprah smiled, placing the book on her shelf. As she prepared for the day's taping, she thought about how easy it would have been to react differently to Peter's initial hostility, to get defensive or angry, to throw him out of her office. Instead, she had chosen to stay true to her values: listening, connecting, finding common ground. 6 months later, Oprah was accepting a prestigious journalism award. As she looked out at the audience, she was surprised to see Peter there with his wife, both applauding. In her acceptance speech, without naming him, she told the story of their interview. "A wise journalist once challenged me about the place of emotion in media," she said to the crowd. "At first, I was hurt by his criticism. But that conversation reminded me of something important, that bridging different perspectives is what good communication is all about. Whether we're talking about politics or parenting, health or happiness, we need both head and heart to truly understand each other." The impact of Peter's article went far beyond what either of them expected. It sparked conversations in journalism schools about the changing nature of media. Older journalists debated with younger ones about the proper role of emotion in reporting. Television executives reconsidered their approach to serious topics. For Oprah, though, the most meaningful outcome wasn't about the media industry at all. A year after their interview, she received a letter from a young journalism student who had read Peter's article. "I'd always thought I had to choose between being objective and being compassionate," the student wrote. "Now I understand that the best journalism makes room for both. Thank you for standing your ground and showing there's more than one way to tell important stories." As Oprah finished reading the letter, she thought about how one conversation had rippled outward, touching lives neither she nor Peter could have anticipated. That was the power of genuine dialogue, not to win arguments, but to create understanding. On her show the following week, without mentioning Peter or their interview, Oprah looked into the camera and shared a thought with her millions of viewers. "Sometimes the people who challenge us most are the ones who help us grow. And sometimes when someone insults you or dismisses your work, the best response isn't anger. It's an invitation to deeper understanding." That invitation, to see beyond assumptions, to connect despite differences, had been at the heart of her work from the beginning. And in an increasingly divided world, it was more important than ever.